Hi everyone, thank you for watching my presentation, Let There Be Light, Activity Throughout the Night in Nesting Common Swifts Due to Artificial Light. My name is Eran, I'm a postdoc at Dartmouth College. This work was done together with Professor Noga Kronfeld-Schor at Tel Aviv University. The common swift is a migratory aerial insectivore that almost never lands and is presumed to sleep in flight. In fact, individuals have been recorded in continuous flight for 10 months straight. They only land regularly when they nest in natural or man-made cracks and crevices. They arrive in Israel, where this work was done, early in the season, and they breed mostly in urban sites. At dusk, they perform this wonderful activity called screaming parties, which is done around the breeding site. They fly around, they scream. It's definitely a social activity, though it's not clear exactly what its purpose is. When this is done, the breeding pair goes to sleep within the nest, and the non-breeding individuals fly off somewhere, presumably to sleep on the wing. The urban environment provides them with great nesting sites, as you can see by the numbers of breeding pairs, 90. Each number here is a nest, that nest between the stones of one of the holiest and most visited sites in Jerusalem, the Western Wall, also known as the Wailing Wall. While the site has been visited at night as well as at day since at least the middle of the 20th century, a few years ago something changed, and the lighting system was replaced to the equivalent of stadium lights, producing much higher artificial light at night, or LM. Artificial light at night is one of the most dramatic and, until not too long ago, the least talked about environmental effects of the Industrial Revolution. Light pollution today is present throughout the globe in almost every habitat, and it grows in an annually increasing rate. This light at night has many impacts on the natural world, including the disruption of circadian and circannual rhythms. We thus hypothesized that 1. Artificial light at night will cause swifts to stretch their activity into the night, not a difficult guess given that this was videoed at 11 at night. And 2, that they will exploit the previously unavailable resource of large, abundant noctuid moths that migrate through that area at that time. We decided to use the Swift's vocalizations to quantify their activity, and so predicted that we will record them later into the night in sites exposed to more artificial light at night. We also predicted we will find moth wing scales in their fecal sacs. We compared 4 sites ranging in artificial light at night intensity, from desert at the bottom, a dry desert canyon, no artificial light at all, so 0 lux of LN, to the 2 intermediary sites, Tel Aviv, basically in the middle of the city, so this is one of the biggest metropolitan areas in Israel, with a artificial light intensity of 0.83 lux, to the slightly higher campus of Bar Ilan University, not far away from Tel Aviv, with 3.85 lux, to the extremely high intensity artificial light, orders of magnitudes more, that you can see in the Western Wall with 120 lux. We put acoustic loggers for 10 or more nights at all sites during the period after hatching, before fledging. So you can see here one of our detectors at the Western Wall site. And we used automatic classification to identify these calls from the tens of thousands of recordings and produce a temporal activity pattern. So you can see here a recording of one of those screaming calls, and here you can see the template that the software used for identification. So we also collected the fecal sacs from the nests in the urban sites. We couldn't reach the ones in the desert because they were completely inaccessible. We even collected feces from between the stones in the Western Wall, so what I hold here in my hand has no better name than holy shit. On the right, you can see examples of moth scales we found in feces, though spoiler, they are not noctuid moths. So here are the results for the temporal activity patterns. The bar at the top shows you whether it's day or night, with yellow for day, black for night. The y-axis is a measure of activity, basically the amount of calls recorded per time unit. The x-axis gives you the time at night, beginning at 5 in the evening, where we started the recordings, and ending at 6 in the morning. And each colored line represents a different colony. So we have desert in blue, we have Tel Aviv in green, and we have Bar Ilan in black. The red line represents the activity at the Western Wall colony in Jerusalem. As you can see, activity stopped earlier in the lower artificial light sites. So lowest, intermediary, a little more, and it never stops at Jerusalem at all. So Western Wall colony is always active throughout the night. Also interesting to notice is the activity peak. See it here for Tel Aviv and Bar Ilan. You see it here for desert. Just before the end of activity, these are those screaming parties I showed you the video of before. Now let's leave wall colony aside for now and look into the finer details of activity timing in the other three sites, the ones with the lower artificial light. We see that activity patterns are correlated to the intensity of the artificial light as well. If we look here, we see the three colonies, and they are arranged from lower to higher intensity light. 0 is the time of sunset, and you see that the end of activity comes earlier the lower the artificial light is. So 15 to 20 minutes in desert before sunset, 20 minutes after sunset in Tel Aviv, and 40 minutes after sunset in Bar Ilan. If we look at the timing of the activity peaks, those screaming parties, we see that they begin at the same time at all colonies, regardless of how intense the artificial light is, but they reach their peak earlier in the darker colonies. So you have a peak of activity that starts at the same time but reaches its peak later, meaning that that entire activity is stretched more the higher intensity the artificial light is. As for the second hypothesis, we found moth scales in all sites at relatively equal frequency, though we didn't look at desert colony. As I mentioned, the nests were inaccessible, but none of the moth scales we found were from noctuid moths. Those are much bigger, have bigger scales than what you see here, and they are probably too big for the swifts to handle. In fact, in hours of observation, I rarely saw them being targeted by the swifts, even though they were there by the dozens where the swifts were obviously foraging. So swifts probably normally eat small moths at dusk and dawn, but this was never reported because the remains were too small to be detected. So let's sum up. We found a significant effect of artificial light at night on the temporal activity patterns of breeding swifts. We saw a dramatic effect in the wall colony and lesser effect where the intensity of the artificial light was lower. I must caution, though, that this was done on the population level and not on the individual level. So you may still have had individuals at wall colony that were not active throughout the night, but on the population level, the population as a whole was. I must also say, I did not have the time to get into it, but we did control for noise pollution and other alternative explanations or anthropogenic effects for the activity patterns, and we found that it was indeed the artificial light. Now, one possible effect of this is on the fledging period. We know that this is resource dependent in swifts, and when you have more resources available or where you have more good weather days available in which to forage, the fledging period shortens. However, we did not verify this in this study, and this is definitely a future research direction that should be taken. Now, the fact that the onset of the screaming parties was synchronized between the colonies, regardless of the intensity of the artificial light, suggests that this stretching of activity that we saw into the night is not due to a shift in the circadian clock per se, but rather a masking effect of the light. Finally, Moth consumption probably naturally occurs, and it may have been unreported thus far due to the smaller size of the remains. So I'm going to end here, and while you enjoy this beautiful photo, I would like to thank Professor Noga Kronfeld-Schor from Tel Aviv University, my co-author, and other people who have helped this project: Tzli Labin from the Israeli Nature and Parks Authority, Professor Yossi Leshem from Tel Aviv University, Itai Bloch from Hebrew University, who is doing himself very interesting work on swifts, and Moran Babayan from Bar Ilan University. If you have any questions or want more information, feel free to reach out and contact me. My details are below. You can also read our publication published in Scientific Reports last year, and I will be available for the conference Q&A session. So with that, thank you very much for listening to my talk. Enjoy the rest of the conference.